not a cloud in the sky. There were over 40 of us, all told, waiting in the parking lot for a taxi ride up the mountain. We could see a bell tower in the distance, amid the trees. That's the Orthodox church, I was told, but that's not where we're going. It wasn't really much of a mountain, not as we think of them at least. Only 1,900 feet above sea level. It was more of a big hill that rose out of a fairly level plain. So what then was all the fuss about? The hill was Mount Tabor in Israel, Palestine. Mount Tabor, though insignificant in stature, looms large in the spiritual sense because tradition has it that it was on this very mount that Jesus was transfigured before his disciples. As I climbed into a taxi, I was not at all sure what I would find when I got up there. The Transfiguration. We all know the story, and we heard it again this morning. Jesus goes up the mountain to pray and takes with him the usual suspects, Peter and James and John. Going off to a mountain is code language in the Bible. Mountains tune us in to the fact that something big is about to happen. Sort of like how the suspenseful music plays in a movie, alerting us that something's coming. The gospel author is alerting us that something momentous is about to happen. It doesn't take long to learn what it is. Jesus, while praying, changes right before their eyes. He is transfigured, catching fire from the inside. And if that wasn't memorable enough, Moses and Elijah drop by for a chat. This is cool stuff. What happens next is typical. Peter, needing to say something, says the first thing that comes to his mind. Rabbi, he says, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, in this part of the world, we would say, bless his heart. Peter is being Peter. Like many of us, Peter couldn't wrap his mind around what had happened. So instead, he opted to be busy, to do something. By putting up booths or dwelling places to mark the spot, he could at least capture the moment. Or perhaps if he could get the VIP visitors to stick around long enough, he could get some other folks up there to see what he and James and John had seen. Jesus, their candidate for Messiah, talking with Moses, who represented the law and who brokered the covenant between Israel and God, and Elijah, who was the greatest of all the prophets. Showing off Jesus with Moses and Elijah would be great PR. That would get people's attention. And then maybe Jesus would stop all this talk about dying. But Peter never got to build. As he was speaking, a cloud enveloped them. Now, it was in a cloud that God had come to Moses on Mount Sinai. And everyone knew that you could not see God and live. So the disciples were terrified, and rightly so. From the cloud a voice came. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. When the cloud cleared, there was no one there. Just Jesus. And they were alone again. Now, ironically, today, at the top of Mount Tabor, there's a church commemorating the Transfiguration. It was built in 1924 amid the ruins of a 6th century Byzantine church and one from Crusader times. The building itself is marvelous. Across the front is a beautiful mural of the Transfiguration. I had to chuckle though, because at the entrance of the church, there are 2 side chapels. One for Moses and one for Elijah. Peter would have been proud. I admit I scoffed a bit, feeling superior, and I wondered if those who had designed and raised the building had read to the end of the story. Building I stood in was made of heavy stone, which was far more substantial than what Peter would have been thinking of. I wondered if the money and the labor that went into building something so contrary to the spirit of the occasion it sought to commemorate. Peter wasn't permitted to build booths, and yet there I stood in a church with all the finest appointments. How did that happen? What were they thinking? We were up on the mount for a couple of hours. We made Eucharist at one of the altars outside, looking over the countryside. After which we were free to wander the church and the grounds until it was time to head back down to the bus. After exploring the grounds and mooing at the milk cow and her calf, and looking out over the hills of Galilee, I wandered back into the church. This second time there was no scoffing. I looked closely at the mural, with Jesus resplendent in light, in conversation with Moses and Elijah. And at the disciples, cowering, not at all sure what to make of it all. I wonder if any of them that morning had any sense that everything was about to change. In the area near the altar are mosaics of wheat and the lamb, obvious symbols of the one who would offer his body to feed the world and give his life to save it. Assembled around the altar was a group of pilgrims from Korea, offering Eucharist together. I could hear clearly in the space, though I didn't understand a single word. But I didn't need to as the familiar liturgy unfolded. There were lessons, and the creed, prayers and responses. Bread and wine were taken in hand, and finally the bread was broken and shared. As they received communion, they sang a song I knew, though with unfamiliar words. Kneeling in my pew, I sang along with them, softly and obtrusively. And I wasn't the only one joining in. It was powerful. In that moment, we were united together, pilgrims from far-flung lands, speaking different languages, and all looking very different from one another, each seeking the face of God's beloved in that place, and finding it in one another. We came to be fed with the divine presence, to be sustained in our earthly pilgrimage. As tears slipped down my cheeks, I understood. It was for this purpose that someone cared enough to build that church. Not to hide from the world, but so that weary pilgrims could encounter the holy in that place. So that, like the disciples, we could meet God as revealed in Jesus, and thus renewed be sent back down the mountain and into the world. That church, set on a hill, with its empty pews, provided a place for this weary pilgrim to encounter the living God in bread broken in community and in shared song. And for that, I am thankful. My sisters and brothers, I don't know what the future holds for St. Francis, but as you consider the future needs of this community, I invite you to remember the church up at the top of Mount Tabor. Sometimes the faithful path is counterintuitive. Sometimes it looks a little foolish, or like we missed a verse or two of the Bible. But my friends, Jesus' call of hospitality is the foundation of all ministry. In his name and at his command, we gather and break bread. Without a building, we cannot gather. And without adequate space, we cannot include all God's children in the worship life of this parish. And let's face it, St. Francis is one of the few places in this part of town where all God's children are truly welcome. It falls to us to provide a place for all of the weary pilgrims in and around Macon to encounter God and to be transformed. It doesn't meet the needs of the world in an obvious sense, but having encountered God in this place, having been nourished at this table, we are sent out into the world to love and serve the Lord. Then the hungry are fed. Then the sick are healed. And then those with no hope have words of comfort spoken to them. What happens at this table? is intimately tied to what happens in the world. It has always been so. So let us celebrate God's transforming power in our lives and in our world. Let us go down the mountain, so to speak, continuing God's work in this community, mindful of the moments of illumination in our lives, and thankful for the briefest of moments when we see and reveal God's glory. Amen.
Amen.